the angel apostasy.
Dusty and covered in rocks, the Hoplitian Pass was unlike the rest of the lush Aegis mountain range. It was wide enough to allow 2 columns of armoured men, but narrowed to one as it inclined to the plateau where the settlement resided. To Perturabo, it appeared more of a mountain fortress than a simple settlement with its high walls and embrasures. He had reached the pass with no resistance, and this ease of movement continued on into the settlement as the portcullis was raised and doors were left open. As he entered, he noticed trading stalls lined up at the edges of the fortifications, with the rest of the settlement built deeper into the mountain. There was little sound on the way up, and with the walls blocking most of the wind, the gentle oiled rubbing of his armor was the only sound to break the plaza's eerie silence. Perturabo prowled throughout the stalls and went further in. Despite being heavily armored, his gear did not betray him. While he had only been in the armory for moments, he had taken his time in the forge, digesting the epiphany-like bursts of knowledge that his exposure to the accoutrements of war elicited. Ruminating on the task at hand, he found he was able to invoke more releases of this internal pool of knowledge by synthesizing already exposed ideas into new devices and creating clear images of them in his mind. He only stopped this recursive loop once he felt the edges of his memory begin to be eaten away. The shade of the overhanging mountain had fully enveloped Perturabo when he heard the dry dragging slither in the darkness. He turned to his left to meet a pair of large olive eyes in a dark tunnel carved into the wall. They immediately raised above his head, and in less than a second the creature shot out from the dark. Its enormous muscular tail moved with the erratic smoothness of a small garden snake. It was led by 2 gangly arms, desperately dragging it forward when they were not throwing rocks out of the way. Its mouth split with serpentine wideness as it screeched and lunged out with a beclawed hand of scythes. Perturabo took a low, patient stance. His shield was a massive thing, half the size of the man with spear-tip peaks and razor-sharp valleys. The bright bronze finish made it a radiant sun on his arm. He parried the blow with ease and pushed back as the shield bit deep into its forearm. With a twist, he wrenched the beast's arm back, drawing out an agonizing wail. It was a short-lived, ugly sound as he continued this fluid motion, bringing the spiked end of his warhammer wetly crunching into its head. The resistance quickly waned from its arm, and with a small twist, its head fell away with a wet slop. Looking closer, it was a bald, unsightly thing, even if it wasn't distorted by the damage. The bladed arms were nearly as thin as the grabber's, with only enough muscle to raise them and let gravity do the rest of the work. Limestone residue was caked up and down the blades. A cursory examination of the tunnel revealed it was crudely carved out relative to the mason precision of the rest. With one last piteous glance, he moved into the tunnels. As he progressed further into the mountain, more and more bioluminescent moss appeared on the floor, providing a slight ambient glow. The path eventually proved to be an offshoot to a far larger tunnel. One way, as he would find out later, led back to the settlement. He chose the other path. As he trudged, he heard the echoes of movement all around him. As he drew further down, the noise became so pervasive, he was able to draw a rough mental map of the local tunnel systems. If the noise was not indication enough, the copious amounts of moss proved to be signage that he was in the right direction. By the time the moss was thick enough for a mortal man to see unaided, another bald beast rushed down the main tunnel, screaming as the one outside did. Perturabo followed up with a mirroring shield parry when a second monster burst from the tunnel to his right. At the last moment, he twisted the handle of his warhammer and adjusted his aim to swat down the second creature's blades. It was his turn to lunge as he rolled to get out from between the pair. The main tunnel buzzed with activity behind him. The danger of his position did not afford him the luxury of a protracted duel. In one swift motion, he let loose both his shield and warhammer. The former struck home, embedding itself in the creature's chest. It impotently scratched at it with claws too long and groped for it with arms too short. The latter only grazed the other monster's face as it rolled with the blow. Incensed by the sting, it lunged forward with sloppy abandon. The half-a-second reaction was all Perturabo needed to unsling his great maul from his back and bring it down on the creature's skull. The ting of bone and viscera bouncing off his embedded shield and armor made him smirk. Taking a step to the side, he raised his great maul with his left hand and brought it down on his shield. The violent ding of metal on metal was partially drowned out by the rending of flesh and snapping of bone as the flipping shield burst forth and tore off half of the creature's abdomen and chest. Perturabo caught it mid-flip with his gauntlet at the cost of warm, pungent entrails painting his armor. After wiping what he could off, re-slinging his great maul and picking up his warhammer, he continued. It did not take him long to reach the mouth of the tunnel, which was sectioned off by a wall of wet, hanging plants. The incessant screeching, while intimidating enough to scare off all but the most iron-willed men, only served to provide Perturabo's enhanced senses with an echo-located image of the chamber beyond. Reaching into a leather pouch on the back of his belt, he pulled out a sphere with a dangling cord. He ripped it out, revealing a small waxy square, and the sphere began to audibly fizz. He parted long, stinking, swollen vines, sprouting 8-pointed leaves, and tossed the sphere into the cavern. He charged the moment of the flash. The massive cavern, glowing blue and purple from moss-lined floor to ceiling, was exactly as he anticipated. Smaller tunnels, like the one he used to enter the cave system, lined the walls. 3 disorganized rows of 3 waited for the assault. Now, temporarily blinded, they writhed, some slamming into one another. Head down, he put his entire weight behind his shield as he rammed into the one most forward-centered. With an extra heave, Perturabo shoved the creature into the stunned ranks, causing them to slither and strike out at one another in confusion. Perturabo loosed his warhammer at the furthest right in the second row. This time his throw struck home with a crunch as its body crumpled on the floor. He charged at the now isolated front rightward serpent and drew his sidearm, a Xiphos. The lone beast's torso twisted back and forth, reeling from the unexpected flash. It prepared best it could with closed eyes by keeping its arms high, ready to strike blindly. Its eyes cleared a moment too late as Perturabo's sword arced upward, clear through its arms. With mechanical speed and precision, he sheathed his sword, snatched the limbs mid-air, twisted around and let them loose again, all before their owner could vocalize its crippling loss. Each blade flew true as they struck deep in the chests of advancing monsters, who laid in wait, flanking the viney corridor from carved holes barely bigger than their occupants. For the moment his flank secured, he assessed the task in front of him. The 7 creatures hissed and screeched at each other while they shook their heads and regained their senses. They were the lesser problem as he took in his quarry. The Gorgonite laid half its bulk in the pools of water that took up the back of the chamber, while the rest lay upon a mound of its own eggs. Green tendrils sprouted like dreads from her head. Their bladed tips were yellow with black dots in their center. 3 of the smaller males rutted upon its lower half, unbothered by the intruder. If the Gorgonite's body moved at all, it was in a plodding, lazy manner. Its eyes, in contrast, glowed yellow with a sharp awareness of the situation. The Gorgonite whistled between guttural barks and clicks. The bald serpent scrambled in reaction to its orders. Perturabo had seen enough. Again pulling free his Xiphos, he ran towards the last monster on the right. His target was on the end of a quickly forming semicircle. It indifferently shoved its dead comrade's head into the earth as it crawled to meet Perturabo more halfway with a lunge. Perturabo dived, sliding the blades off of the surface of his shield before he rolled behind it. On one knee, he slammed the sharp point of his shield into its hide with a backhanded strike. It pierced through its scales, and he yanked, severing its spinal cord, but leaving his shield embedded and stuck. His arms slid from the shield's leather handle as he broke into a run. The other creatures were moving in on him now. He leaned down and snatched his warhammer without breaking stride, and after a second, jerked and turned. He had narrowed them to as small a column as he could manage, and charged. He met the first one's predictable overhead strike with a parry from his blade. He followed up with a wicked slam of his warhammer to its core, crushing one of the small arms in the swing. A leathery belly gave way as internal organs burst from the pressure. He threw the blades off as its body collapsed forward. In a frantic rush, another began climbing over the fallen before it had fully perished. Perturabo grimaced at its callousness. He crouched to spring and pierce his blade through its chin, but the sound to his right changed his plans. He dived to the left a moment before the Gorgonite's massive tail lifted from the water and slammed with a crack right where he was standing, inadvertently crushing both serpents beneath its weight. He laughed a hard laugh behind a frenzied smile. The broodmother was more clever than he anticipated. As he gained his footing, he was attacked from the left and his front simultaneously, with the other two coming in from his right. He was surrounded. He would not take a step back against such filth, so instead he moved in. He parried a blade to his left with his warhammer. The other raked his vambrace and found purchase in the joint, drawing blood. He turned his back on the other, relying on his armor to absorb the punishment. He felt the sharp pressure as the back of his chest plate bent in, but not quite pierced, while a great weight came down upon his right shoulder. A blade caught in the heavy metal of his pauldron. The trust in his crafts proved wise, as the assault did not impede his counterattack. He raised his sword against the weight and brought it down through the arm of the parried scythe. His warhammer freed, he spun left, bringing the flat side down on his flanked attacker's head. The creature's puny skull was no hindrance to his inhuman musculature, and he continued his momentum, spinning around to thrust through the one-armed monster's face. A whirlwind of fury, he yanked his Zephos diagonally through its jaw and spun into a crouch just out of reach of the oncoming vertical and horizontal strikes of the remaining two monsters. Without missing a beat, he sprung up, dragging his Zephos in an underhanded slash through the rightmost beast's abdomen, leaving the sword stuck in its sternum. With both hands, he grabbed the warhammer above his head and brought it down on the last beast's, splitting it like a melon. Perturabo let out a satisfied sigh as he whipped his head back. His helm's drenched plume snapped as it splattered behind him. His post-slay glow was interrupted by a near imperceptible change in air pressure. The fractured reptilian yellow eyes, rapidly rushing to meet his, would have petrified the heart of a lesser man with fear. Instead, he raised his warhammer at the last moment. The Gorgonite's massive hand, decorated with a wicked talon on each finger, aimed to separate his torso from his legs. The last-moment intervention of the warhammer robbed the blow of some of its force, saving Perturabo's head. His helm and chestplate were not so lucky. The talons bit deep through the plate and into the flesh beneath. The impact took him off his feet, sending him flying back with his warhammer soaring across the chamber. In the muddy filth, battered and bloodied, Perturabo peeled away his tattered helm like aluminum foil, revealing a laceration below his eye, which stretched across his face, leaving a trench through his nose. As he rose, he unclasped his chestplate, catching his great maul as the plate fell from him. Coagulated blood stained his chest, muscle fibers already knitting themselves back together. The Gorgonite wasted no time. Before Perturabo was fully erect, its hand outstretched to slam his body into a bloody pulp. Now, aware of the beast's true nature, he would not be surprised again. His left hand grasped right above the grip at the bottom of the shaft as he appeared to sluggishly rise. The moment the Gorgonite's claw entered into range, he twisted, grasping the grip with his other hand, and with a mighty swing he struck home. Leathery flesh split, bone buckled, and talons loosened in their sockets as the great maul disfigured its target. The Den Mother reeled back with the momentum of the blow and let loose a deafening howl while her tendrils spasmed in agony. She held her mangled hand up as it twitched and spurted blood. After a glance at it, she wheeled around, her fang-filled mouth open in a silent apoplectic scream. In turning to fully face him, she thoughtlessly crushed her chosen mates underneath her heft. She slithered and clawed at the ground, ripping gouges in the floor to get at him sooner. Mouth open, she darted at him head first. Perturabo unleashed a bestial roar in response as he charged. The tendrils shot out before her head. Perturabo ducked and weaved. A bladed tip sliced through one vambrace with no resistance, carving deep into his forearm. The rest only inflicted glancing blows on his cheeks and shoulders. With a titanic stomp of his left leg, he transferred all of his momentum into his great maul. Its head met the Gorgonite's between the eyes. The gargantuan beast kept going for a small distance as its skull caved, and eyes burst from their sockets, staring at each other for a fraction of a second before immediate brain death. Its corpulent bulk slid forward, pushing against Perturabo's anchored legs, planting him further in the ground.